Hello and welcome to all of you joining us today on Zoom or watching us on the live feed on Facebook. My name is Ahmed Mursi. I'm a co-founder of the Arab Political Science Network, APSN, and I'm a visiting fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Qatar. Before I share more about today's session and introduce our moderator, let me remind you that this session is recorded and there is simultaneous Arabic interpretation that's only available through Zoom, and you can find it through the button at the bottom of the screen that has the globe-looking button or the language sign, and you can choose Arabic or English. You can also send your questions through the Q&A button that's available in Zoom. Our webinar today is titled War, Media, and Disinformation, and it will look at the role of media and disinformation campaigns with a special focus on the wars and conflicts in Palestine, Syria, and Sudan. This is the second session in a 5-part series titled Politics and War in the Middle East and North Africa that brings in together researchers, professionals to share research findings and expertise about the topics of discussion. This project is a collaboration between the Arab Political Science Network, the Center for Economic, Legal, and Social Studies and Documentation, CEDEJ, and the Middle East Studies Program at the American University in Cairo. We will share more information about the organizers and about the project through the chat. So you can also have an opportunity to participate in the sessions that will be coming in the next couple of months, and also in possibly share more information with your networks and colleagues about other events that we will be organizing. Today's session is moderated by Khaled Al-Arab, who's an associate professor of practice and director of the Middle East Studies Program at AUC. Khaled is a seasoned journalist who covered since 2003 numerous major stories from uprisings to wars across the region for regional and international news organizations. Khaled continues to publish in Egyptian and Arab media, and his work, particularly long-form documentaries, won a number of awards in Egypt and the United Kingdom. I'll leave Khaled to introduce our speakers and guide us through the session today. Thank you, Khaled, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Ahmed, very much, and thank you for taking the lead on organizing this project. It's a very useful project and very timely as well. And today's session, titled, as Ahmed said, War, Media, and Disinformation, fits within this broader project in discussing politics and war in the Middle East and North Africa. The old cliche, of course, is that truth is the first casualty in war, and it is an accurate description, I think, of what happens. But the more interesting question for me is, how does this happen? Why? What are the mechanisms that produce the mis and the disinformation that spread during times of conflict and during times of war? Speaking from experience as a journalist, you are always struggling when you're covering a conflict. You're always struggling with this issue of misinformation and disinformation. You have very limited access normally as a journalist to the areas of conflict, and so you have to rely on sources who might have strong access, good access to information, but these sources are usually the least impartial sources because they are parties to the conflict. And so you're trying to balance the need to get good information with the need to maintain, to test this information and make sure that you are not being used yourself as a part of the disinformation campaign that's inadvertently being run by one or two sides of the conflict. So I'm really, it's my real pleasure to have this panel today to highlight the issue of war media and disinformation in three of the most pressing conflicts in the region: Syria, Palestine, and Sudan. Dr. Kati El-Hayek will be talking about the situation in Syria. She's an assistant professor in the School of Professional Communication at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. Her research centers around themes of marginality, media, audiences, gender, intersectionality, and migration. El-Hayek completed her PhD in communication at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the United States of America with a graduate certificate in advanced feminist studies. It's a pleasure to have you, Kati, today, and I'm looking forward to your input. Dr. Wissam Amer will be presenting on the title of the session in the context of the war in Gaza and the Palestinian context in general. Dr. Wissam is a SRF fellow and visiting professor at Cambridge. Since 2020, he has been the dean of the Faculty of Communication and Languages at Gaza University. I'll leave him to tell us, if he wants, a little bit about his experience, his recent experience in Gaza, because he was there when the war started after the October 7th attacks. He was a Fulbright scholar and researcher at Harvard University Center for Middle Eastern Studies in 2022. His interests in teaching and research center around political communication, violent language, warfare, and contemporary geopolitics, with a specific focus on terrorism, security, and radicalization. A pleasure to have you, Wissam, and looking forward to hear from you. Hamid Khalafallah will be tackling the issue in the context of the conflict in Sudan. Hamid is a development practitioner, researcher, and policy analyst. He is currently a PhD researcher at the Global Development Institute of the University of Manchester, researching grassroots movements and political transitions in Africa. Before that, Hamid worked for various international organizations in Sudan, focusing on governance and development issues. Hamid's research interests include participatory governance, democracy and democratization processes, citizen state engagement, and inclusive development. Very pleased to have you today, Hamid, and looking forward to your input as well. So we'll start with 10 minutes for each speaker. And after that, we'll move on to a question and answer session, either by the audience or I'll be asking perhaps a couple of questions myself after the speakers finish their presentations. Kati, over to you. Start us off.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking the Arab Political Science Network and the Middle East program at American University in Cairo, and my co-panelists for joining us today and for organizing this important, although it's a difficult conversation. I want to share with you some slides and images so you can bear with me. Of course, war and media and disinformation in Syria is really a complex and multifaceted topic, but I want to share with you some highlights, especially focusing on the Syrian revolution in 2011 and moving forward. But I want to start a little bit, especially if some of you are joining more like from the general audience, to define disinformation and to focus that it's different from misinformation by referring to the false and misleading information that intentionally social and political actors spread for political and economic gain, either to profit, either to create harm, either to advance political or ideological goals, or all of these goals together. And this information is something not new. Maybe in the recent years, we are using, especially post 2016 and the election of Trump in the United States, maybe we are using this terms more, but actually some scholars say that this information come even from 44 PC era, especially with the invention in printing in the 15th century. This information and the weaponization of information became widespread globally. And maybe if we can think about research from the past around propaganda, conspiracy theories, false and misleading narrative, and misrepresentation, actually we are describing the same issues that we are describing when we are referring to disinformation. And for us in the Arabic-speaking region, all of us maybe grow up with a significant disinformation example, which is the the invasion of Iraq, and how Bush administration at the time in the Second Iraq War used disinformation and the claim that weapons of mass destruction were found. So this very brief context to move into disinformation in Syria. Disinformation, like in anywhere around the world, to understand this information in Syria, we should understand that it is something deeply contextual. It uses specific local, cultural, and political references that maybe audiences in different contexts will not be affected by it. And it is, as I said a little bit ago, it is produced by social and political actors. If we want to think about the big picture, who wants to maintain inequality and injustice in the context they are targeting audiences in, because to protect their political benefits and their economic gains. And the goal in Syria and beyond is, from this information, is to create this idea of public acceptance, that the public opinion in a particular country, like I will show in Syria, will accept atrocities, will accept injustice, and will accept the ruling political power in their society. So building on that, since the Arab Spring and the start of the Syrian revolution in 2011, Al-Assad regime really used effectively disinformation. He immediately, the regime framed a protester as, in Arabic we say mundassin, as extremists, as someone who are funded by foreign power to attack the resistance of the Syrian regime. And some scholars would say that the Syrian Electronic Army may be one of the first armies in recent history that really, in a systematic way, used disinformation as part of the war that Al-Assad regime launched at the beginning, civilian protesters and then the opposition. And from the beginning, in a systematic way, there is also a lot of research, and I'm happy to recommend it later for anyone who is interested. We saw on social media this type of images that you are seeing on the screen, that Bashar al-Assad framed himself as the protector of minorities, and he, like, here you say, like, Ta'ifati Suri, like my sect is Syrian, which we might think it's a neutral, but as I said, this information is contextual, and in the Syrian context, a lot of audiences would like feel that he's referring to sectarian narrative, and he's saying, like, as I'm the leader of this country, we are all Syrians, but if I will go sectarian war and targeting of minority will happen. This like the hidden message. And this information was actually documented. So while the Syrian regime was the main actor, even like sometimes there are some accounts of the opposition or even some activists using this information for different purposes. This topic is multifaceted and really complex, and now in the recent years we are developing tools to study more systematically this information. But the Syrian campaign in 2022 actually published a report, and they were effective in, for example, showing how Russian actors, governmental actors, actually used this information in Syria. They analyzed some official accounts affiliated with Russian government and how they participated in this information. Especially the peak time was in 2018. Now, after the fall of al-Assad regime on December 2024, we saw this information actually picking immediately since the first moments. Of course, a lot of Syrian people and people who have solidarity with what Syrians have been through in the last few decades we're seeing the images coming up from political prisons, especially Sednaya, but actually the grief, this like awful human rights violation that happened in these prisons were impacted by systematic disinformation campaigns. We saw narrative online about secret cells that did not exist. We saw, like you are seeing to my right, images that were fake. Like these two images really were widespread online, but they were proved by Verify Syria تأكد initiative, which I will talk about in a little bit, were found false. And this narrative, of course, is very harmful because they affected the families of the victims who did not know the truth about what their loved one went through, and it affected the whole trust in society. Also, misinformation happened sometimes by international journalists, like the CNN reporter Kalyarsa Ward, and maybe some people, especially from the Palestinian context or other contexts, and even me in my research early on in the Syrian revolution and the refugee crisis in Jordan, I documented some of her problematic reporting. So she had a lot of problematic reporting in the past, but in this particular example, she participated in disinformation by framing. Maybe she did not know. We don't know. Like you can see the video and judge for yourself. But they had like this story on CNN that claimed that they were freeing a political prisoner from the Syrian regime prisons. But we discovered later that this person is actually a former intelligence officer who had a disagreement within the Syrian regime security branch that he was working with, and they imprisoned him because he had like some maybe thief or other like actions that he did and they did not approve of. So this shows the complexities of the current moment we live in, where disinformation is spread in more legacy traditional media, but also in social media. And in the Syrian context, as I said from the beginning, the Syrian regime framed the conflict in sectarian coded terms. So he maintained power and pressure on international audience. Now we are also seeing a lot of sectarian-based disinformation, like the minority observatory, Syrian Minority Observatory, with actors that we really like. It's hard to track, and when activists are trying to communicate with them, they send them threats, and there is incidents of like sexual harassment and threats of rape against one activist. And there is also connection to regional political powers like Israel. In sum, I want to say that as now, like Syrian society trying to move forward, moving from the previous regime atrocities and moving from long years of war and displacement, we are like this information affecting the documentation of mass atrocities. Also, when the Syrian regime collapsed, there was a lot of chaos that affected documentation of the previous human rights violation. The risk now is atrocity denial, that a lot of people, because of the disinformation they're consuming in the media and social media, will question the credibility of genuine human rights abuses that the regime and his affiliated groups committed in Syria in the last few years. And this is really weakening truth and justice and transnational justice moving forward. There is a media initiative called تأكد, Verify, that really doing great job in documenting these issues and trying to control disinformation and providing evidence-based narrative for audiences. I will conclude by recommending actually a colleague and friend of mine, Noura Zizawi, published, if you want to read more about these issues, published recently an article that I recommend for further information. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you. Thank you for this overview. I'm sure there are a lot of points that we can go further into more detail in the Q&A session. Just let me remind you that if you have any questions, you can press the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question in there, and hopefully we'll get a chance to go over all the questions. Wissam, over to you.
Thank you so much, Khaled, and thanks to Ahmed as well for organizing this very important and very timely event. Also, thanks to the panelists sharing their experiences from different regions, from Syria and from Sudan as well. It's a great privilege and honor for me to be here and share experiences. Actually, talking about my personal experience in Gaza, and linking to the media, I would say actually the words used to describe the Israeli crimes in Gaza, like genocide, massacre, war, conflict, all these terms used in media, would, from my personal experience, would say they would not describe the situation as it is on the ground. It's much beyond that. It's much beyond the suffering that people in Gaza, have been facing and experiencing for the past 16 months. during the Israeli crimes and war, actually, would not really find a suitable word so far to describe, how much awful to live and experience the Israeli aggression. Also, the Israeli war is not happening against Gaza only, as it would be represented and portrayed in the media. There is another war happening actually in the West Bank. What is happening in Jenin, Tul Karim, in Ramallah, and all of the Palestinian cities in the West Bank. Also, the people, the Palestinians living in Jerusalem, do not get much attention in media. So there is a war happening against all Palestinians. Of course, the war on Gaza, and actually, I would say it's not in Gaza, because like using the proverbs, the prepositions would also mislead the audience, especially if we talk about media language, because the Israeli war on Gaza happens in all cities of the Gaza Strip, from the north to the south. When we say it's the Israel war in Gaza, this might lead to some confusion that some other parts of Gaza do not witness or do not experience war. It's actually a war on Gaza. It's the Israeli war on Gaza, and actually it is a genocidal war that Israel aims to erase Palestinians from their indigenous land. I call it another Nakba, because what we experience in Gaza, the current generation, is a continuous catastrophe. There have been experiencing the continuous catastrophe that happened in 1948 and the Naksa, the catastrophe in 1967. Our grandparents and parents who were forcibly forced to leave their indigenous villages and cities in 1948 and take a refuge in Gaza Strip. We, the current generation, face and experience the same Nakba, the same catastrophe, I would say. So talking about media and disinformation campaigns, of course, as Dr. Khalid mentioned, the truth is the first casualty of the war. Over the past 15 months, the Israeli war on Gaza has developed into a harrowing period of relentless and indiscriminate bloodshed, culminating in unprecedented and alarming toll on civilian lives. Israel targets the civilians and deliberately. Israel aims to kill as many Palestinians as possible, mainly the civilians. We could talk about over 61,000 of people killed, among of them over 20,000 of children. We talk about over 111,000 of people injured, and thousands of people, are burned under the rubbles of their houses. If not all, at least 95 to 99% of the people in Gaza have been displaced, not only one time, but several times. So this continuous Nakba is distinguished actually by being as the longest lived or the longest lived catastrophe, and the most and longest televised or mediated or communicated genocide on mainstream media, and of course on social media, and of course within the mediated campaigns, there are, of course, many disinformation and misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So since October 7th, the war in Gaza has been marked not only by the intense military operations, but also as an unprecedented battle over information. I would say while the physical war unfolds on the ground, an equally significant war is being fought in the media, shaping global perceptions, justifying actions, and influencing policy decisions. So information war is now a key element of the modern conflicts, the modern wars, and of course it is very clear in the Israeli war on Gaza, you know, where media organizations and digital platforms play a crucial role in crafting the narratives. In a minute, I will give some examples. So the war is not just about facts, but also about who controls the narrative, and who gets to be heard, who controls, who narrates the narrative, the discourse, and of course, who gets to be heard, to be voiced, and how public opinion is manipulated through both mainstream media and social media. And recently, we have witnessed the AI propaganda, the AI generated propaganda machines in the Israeli to manipulate the public opinion about the Israeli war and aggressions on in Gaza. So back to specifically actually on Gaza war, talking about mainstream media biases, I would say this is not really new for us. There is no much change between the current war and the previous war coverage in media, mainly the Western media outlets. For example, if we talk about BBC, CNN, New York Times, The Guardian, despite there are ideological differences and political agenda between or among these media outlets, I would say, like being conservative, being liberal, would not really make a big difference once these media outlets deal with or treat the Israeli wars on Gaza. Of course, there is a big difference between The Guardian and The Times, London, for example, but both newspapers would not make a major difference in their coverage of the Israeli war. And the same example, I would say, between the New York Times and the Washington Post would not make difference in their coverage of the Israeli war on Gaza. One of these media biases, I would say one is the labeling of the war, how to name the genocide. One example, you know, to call or to name the genocide is the Israeli-Hamas war. And this is a very misleading and disinforming title or labeling of the war, because the Israeli war is not directed only against Hamas. It's against all Palestinians in Gaza. And if you look at all the Western media outlets labeling of the Israeli war in Gaza, they call it Israel-Hamas war. This means that they represent Hamas as a militia or as unaccepted group that you know, that Israel targets. In a way or another, this indirectly legitimizes Israeli actions and Israeli crimes against people. And of course, this is here the strategy of problematization, the strategy of blaming one part over the other. And here is Hamas and Palestinians in Gaza are much blamed. Just from the title, you can see like how harmful such media treatment is against the Palestinians. Of course, labeling is a political act that aims to identify the inclusion and exclusion of others. Another example on the media, in the Western media outlets, misinformation and disinformation campaigns. The war is portrayed as retaliation, or Israeli retaliation to the Palestinian or to Hamas mainly actions. This means action versus reaction. And in this context, the Israeli reactions come as a result to Hamas actions of the October 7th. And they ignore, the media outlets unintentionally ignores the context, the historical context of the October 7th. We have been living in Gaza mainly under Israeli blockade and siege for the past 17 years. And portraying the Israeli crimes and aggressions on Gaza as retaliatory versus offensive would, in a way or another, justifies the Israeli actions. And this would reinforce the idea that Israel acting as self-defense. And I'm sure it is very popular in media how Israel represented as self-defendant rather than as an aggressor. And you can see also the words like clashes versus attacks or resistance. Palestinian actions are represented or presented actually as attacks and as clashes rather than, as a legitimate resistance to the Israeli occupation. The missing context in such media coverage and misinformation campaigns, would mislead and reshape the public opinion on the Israeli war on Gaza. There are many examples about how the media campaigns or media coverage treats unobjectively the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. One of them is like using the word died versus killed, where the Palestinians are portrayed as death. The Palestinians died, but actually there is no any reason or justification, I would say, presented why they died. And this is very much clear actually in Trump's meeting with Netanyahu in the last weeks. If we heard to Trump's speech and all the in the press conference, he has never mentioned that Israel is responsible for the killing of Palestinians in Gaza. He talks about the destruction of Gaza. He talks about the number of people killed or the high number of people killed in Gaza. But he has never mentioned the real reason why those Palestinians died.
Yeah.
I know the time is very limited, but there are many examples. And actually, one of these examples on social media, the war continues with many campaigns, and now you can see how the digital censorship imposed by Meta, by X, or by WhatsApp group, WhatsApp.
Wissam, hold on to this thought because I want to come back to it, and I'm mindful that we're taking on Hamid's time. So hold on to this thought about the social media platforms and this role. It is very important, and we should circle back to it. Hamid, sorry for keeping you waiting.
Sorry for being late. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
No problem, and thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm so pleased to be here. And in speaking about the war in Sudan, which started between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces in April 2023, and particularly when you speak about media and disinformation and how it impacts wars or how it's impacted by wars and so on, I think when speaking about Sudan, it's important to start by acknowledging how the war in Sudan is completely ignored by media outlets, whether internationally or regionally, in the African, Arab regions and so on, and internationally at large. And that is quite problematic and shows you, all the bias in media outlets and so on, and how that, kind of allows for disinformation campaigns to flourish, because when, quote unquote, good media is absent, you're creating space for bad media, essentially. A report that was released a few months ago, or a few weeks ago rather, by an analytics firm called Chartbeat, shows how the average news coverage in 2024, last year, of the war in Ukraine, as well as the Israeli war on Gaza, was around 200,000 stories per month. That is the average, 200,000 stories. The war in Yemen, there was around 100,000 stories per month. The war in Sudan, the largest humanitarian crisis by scale at the moment, with 13 million people displaced, 50 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and facing hunger and a food shortage crisis and famine, a looming famine in many parts of the country and so on, was not mentioned even 1,000 stories per month. So that shows you a clear gap in how the media covered Sudan and how that allows for disinformation campaigns to flourish. And I think, the disinformation campaigns that we are seeing in Sudan at the moment and so on started before the war even started, where both warring factions kind of use disinformation campaigns to lay the ground for the war to erupt and to create reasons that were not there for the war to start and to justify the war. And in many ways, I think it's important to think about how the disinformation campaigns in Sudan are not a byproduct of the war. In fact, they are an integral part of the war. They're an essential part that both warring factions are putting so much resources and using them. And as much as the battlefield and the war on the ground is evolving, the virtual war is evolving as well. Because both of them need to create justification for what they are fighting, because in so many ways, the war does not make sense to any of the Sudanese citizens, if you will. So that's why the warring factions need to create reasons and need to justify why they're fighting. And both of them, like I mentioned, have pulled so much resources into kind of fueling this virtual war on social media and also traditional media outlets. For instance, the Sudanese Armed Forces is using the same quote-unquote electronic jihad unit that was established by the Bashir regime and that was working for many decades before the revolution happened in Sudan in 2019, similar to what was just mentioned in the context of Syria. So this unit was, an essential and integral part of the Bashir's regime, and now that is the same unit that is supporting and fueling the disinformation campaigns and the war propaganda that the Sudanese armed forces are kind of propagating. Then as for the rapid support forces, they have been signing multi-million dollar contracts with international PR companies in Canada, in France, in the United Arab Emirates, and so on, to build their social media presence and their tools to propagate these disinformation campaigns and war propaganda. And I think to understand the context of disinformation campaigns in Sudan, it's also important to understand what the war in Sudan is about and what it is. Because when we look at media, you see a lot of, labels that misdefine the war in Sudan. Particularly in Western media, you see the term civil war being used a lot. And that's, of course, a derogatory term that is used deliberately to kind of show it as an internal issue in Sudan, something that is expected in this, African context where people just kill each other and fight and so on. It is used very deliberately to kind of remove any liability from any Western countries that have been part of the war in so many ways, and also a lot of regional countries. But it's not a civil war in any way. It is a war on civilians, if anything. It is a counter-revolutionary war that was, that is waged by the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces and other internal actors, but they are also supported by the regional and international actors who have shared capital interests in Sudan. And it is mainly around not seeing Sudan as a democratically civilian-led country. And that is, what shapes this war and what shapes how the disinformation campaigns are working. As I mentioned, both of the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces are using disinformation campaigns to justify their war and to, polarize citizens and try to get their support to one side or the other, and also to manipulate the international community and make them believe things that they want them to believe. For instance, the Sudanese Armed Forces, insist on how this is a war, for the sovereignty of Sudan and to protect the unity of Sudan and to maintain stability in the country. While the Rapid Support Forces try to portray that this is a war for democracy and against the former regime of Omar al-Bashir, who are trying to take over power again. Now, neither of these narratives that they're trying to push forward are true, but this is how they are trying to kind of justify the war and get support to one side or the other. I will end very quickly by mentioning a few impacts that the disinformation campaigns propagated by the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces have, caused in the Sudanese context. First of all, these disinformation campaigns were quite harmful and put a lot of millions of lives at risk, actually, because Sudanese people, when being displaced from one part to the other or trying to get food in a context of, a famine and so on, they go online and try to find information online to guide them on, where to find something or where to go from point A to point B, only to find a lot of, disinformation and misinformation that puts their life at risk. And there are so many stories of people who, went online and saw that the Sudanese Armed Forces or the Rapid Support Forces said that, they have liberated, quote unquote, one part or another, and it's now free for people to move, and there are no risk at all. And they start moving there, and then they get, exposed to risks and dangers. Another impact that it had is that the way these disinformation campaigns have been in many ways propagating racially charged and ethnically charged and hate speech that has polarized citizens, divided citizens along, ethnic and racial lines and so on, which has eventually turned the war into a civil war in some parts of the country, particularly in Darfur, that is, still living the impacts of 20 years of war that the regime of Bashir started in 2003. Another impact that it had is that, the way also particularly the Sudanese armed forces, have been communicating a lot of disinformation online and so on, has helped in, pushing citizens to pick up arms and join fighting. And that is also kind of mobilizing communities and making them pick up arms. And we know how, once you pick up arms to defend yourself, essentially, it's very difficult to put these arms down when the war ends. Another thing is that, disinformation has been used as a tool of oppressing civilian actors and politicians, and essentially eliminating civic space and basically killing civil politics. There is no space for civilians to, debate, to have discussions about how the war could or should end and what are their perspectives for peace in Sudan and so on, because all of these spaces are, completely taken over by disinformation campaigns, particularly against civilian actors and political groups, and kind of, labeling them as traitors, labeling them as agents of the West, labeling them as, all sorts of things that kind of stop them from playing the role that they should play in, articulating visions to end the war in Sudan. And essentially what also these disinformation campaigns are doing is impeding the prospects of peace in Sudan. We see how every time there are, in peace initiatives and talks about peace in Sudan, the amount of disinformation goes up against these these peace initiatives. The very last point that I would mention is that also when looking at analyzing these disinformation campaigns is doing military rule in Sudan after the war ends. And I could end it here, Khalid.
Thank you, Hamid, very much. And thank you for keeping to the time. The sound unfortunately cut off towards your very last point. But I will come back to you because there are questions for you from the audience. So I'll come back to you. And if you'd like to go over this, that would be great. So we have a lot of questions from the audience, and unfortunately only 8 minutes until the end of the session. What I'll do is, so I'm not sure if Kathy is here or not, but I'll move on to a question for you. So, Kathy is here. Type. Very good. So, Kathy, let me start with a question that has been directed to you. It's in Arabic, but I'll try to translate it quickly into English. How could someone, a journalist or a fact checker who is not familiar with the Syrian context, find out about mis and disinformation in Syria?
So it's really a challenge. Like if you're not expert, I think like I'm gonna share. Can I share in? Sorry. I'm gonna share Verify. Maybe they like talk more about the technological side of. I'm sharing like a link of Verify, which is the media initiative I talked. Like they have their like more technological method to verify information. So if you can like look into that and maybe read about how they do it. So that's one way. Another way, I think, it's still like a personal connection, like talking with expert in the field, double check, like old-fashioned type of like double checking, like if something is not urgent news, just like take your time, talk with multiple sources, and if you have the energy and the skill to like learn more, how you can verify images, how you can sometimes, because now like technology and deepfake are really very advanced, so like we really need we are working in journalism, more equip ourselves with also like more technological skills to verify videos and images.
Okay, thank you, Kathy, very much. And if I may add, I mean, it's difficult, and even fact checkers sometimes get it wrong. So just take it all with a pinch of salt. Don't trust anything too much. Question for you, Wissam. The question says, it has been noticeable how biased the New York Times reporting of the Palestinian war has been overall. Do you have any insight into how the New York Times editorial policy has been developed to present such a bias? And if I'm rephrasing here, but I mean, what can be said about the New York Times can also be said about other media outlets. And I think it's quite interesting to look into this process by which the editorial policy is created. If you have any insights into this in 2 minutes. You're muted, Yosef.
Sorry. Yeah, just briefly to answer this question. For the current war, you know, like the language used by the New York Times is much biased to the Israeli narrative. For example, the New York Times uses terms like or representation strategies to refer to the Palestinian fighters like as Hamas militants, you know, killed in the war, rather than, you know, Palestinian civilians killed in the war. You can like portraying all Palestinians as if they are Hamas militants, and this is really very misleading, you know, to the to New York Times readers. Another example of the casualties, the reporting on the Palestinian casualties, there is always doubting about, you know, the numbers of Palestinians killed. And this, in this case, New York Times cites the Israeli allegations, you know, in reporting Palestinian casualties. And they say, you know, Hamas Ministry of Health, rather than, you know, referring to the resources, UN resources or OCHA resources, for example. Also, New York Times focuses much on Israeli security concerns rather than Palestinian rights to survive and live. Of course, there is a big lack of context in the New York Times coverage of the Israeli the war. Just two quick points, I would say, to host experts, you know, or commentary experts and op-ed or opinion articles authors is very important. I would say if we just do a quick comparison for the Israeli voices given in the New York Times is really much higher than the Palestinian voices. All these insights would give, you know, a certain way how New York Times represents the Israeli war on Gaza.
Thank you, Sam, very much. Okay, last question for you, Hamid. And it says, I'm curious to hear about covering on-the-ground updates in Sudan without relying on already published articles on the internet, which might be basically disseminating propaganda or mis or disinformation. Do journalists, what kind of access basically do journalists in Sudan trying to cover the war on the ground have currently in Sudan?
Sure. And just to mention the last point that I mentioned earlier, in case it wasn't heard, and I'm so sorry that my line cut off at the point at the end. What I was saying is that the most dangerous impact of the disinformation campaign that both warring factions are using is that two things. It's basically impeding all efforts towards peace in Sudan and making it very difficult to establish a peace process. And the other thing is that they are laying the ground for an authoritarian military rule after the war ends. This is what they're essentially trying to do. Now, on journalist access to Sudan, obviously it's very difficult and challenging. However, it just needs a lot of resources and a lot of push from the international community, because depending on which side of the country you're trying to go to, you need to have permissions from one of the warring factions or the other. What we have seen is that with different international media outlets and so on, they managed to get some journalists on the ground. Sky News keeps on getting journalists on the ground, but there's also a pattern that you see. You see that international media and regional media outlets that have Sudanese journalists send Sudanese journalists back to Sudan. Those who don't have, they don't necessarily. So what to me says, although there are difficulties imposed by the warring factions on having access to the country and coming inside and so on, it seems to me that the Sudanese journalists within these institutions are the ones who are pushing for that, and they get sent eventually to Sudan. But what this suggests is that these media outlets are not putting enough resources or, pressure to kind of send journalists into the country.
Okay. Hamid, thank you very much. Now, I'm mindful that we are out of time, but I did cut you off shortly, Wissam, when you were just going to talk about the social media platform's role. Are you happy to take, I know that you need to leave, but are you happy to take a minute or two to comment on this?
Okay, no problem. Just quickly, also in social media platforms, there are also disinformation campaigns. One of them, I think, the virality of fake news and manipulated content, creating AI-generated images, misleading videos, and using the old images. Also, on social media, I would say there is much digital censorship where the Palestinian voices are not really allowed much. And you can see the algorithmic bias in removing the Palestinian context. So I would say social media platforms, although they serve as conduits for information dissemination, they also possess the power to suppress content, and especially the Palestinian content, unfortunately, intentionally and inadvertently. So there is much, censorship on the Palestinian activists and journalists, using social media platforms.
Yeah, and I mean, I would recommend anyone who is interested in more looking deeper into this, check out Hamle. It's a Palestinian center that publishes very good research on the digital rights of Palestinians, and we've seen how the opinion polls across generations were different in the United States. For example, people who are the younger generation, which is relying more on TikTok, was less susceptible to misinformation towards Israel than older generations. Thank you to all the speakers, Katie El-Hayek, Wissam Amer, Hamid Khalafallah. Thank you very much for your very valuable insights today, and thank you for the audience. I'm sorry we didn't get enough time to go over more questions, but unfortunately, that's all the time we had for today. Thank you all, and see you next time in the next webinar on war and politics in MENA. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.